Hi, this screencast is about fertilizers and an unintended consequence of that called eutrophication. Okay, so remember earlier in the year, way earlier in the, like the beginning of the year, we talked about the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle. And basically, the idea is nitrogen and phosphorus are necessary for building DNA, amino acids. So, in order for a cell to grow and to form, it needs these components. And they tend to just cycle in nature, right? So, what we find is like a nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil go up into the roots of the plant. They end up in all parts of the plant. When the leaves fall off the plant, they come here. Decomposing organisms like bacteria and molds and insects will then return it to the ground, either through their feces or urine or just by just eating it, and it just goes right back in. So basically, the energy comes in the form of light, and carbon dioxide comes in, and water comes in, and so the plant gets energy that way. But the nutrients tend to just cycle right where they are for the most part. Okay, and that's the way nature intends things to work. But when people grow crops, we have a tendency to disrupt this. So what we do is we have a tendency to um, when we harvest a plant, we tend to take most of the plant away. We might leave the roots behind. We might not, right? But basically, what happened is that nitrogen and phosphorus that came out of the soil and went up the roots into the plants. Now, if I take the plants away, that means that cycle has been broken, and these nitrogen and phosphorus atoms are not going to come back into our cropland. And so what farmers find is that after you can take even the most fertile soil you can imagine, but after a few years of harvesting crops and carrying away the nitrogen and phosphorus without returning it, the soil becomes depleted and it becomes infertile. So you just end up with stunted plants that don't grow very well. And so humans have known about this for a long time, right? Basically, as long as they've been farming, they realize that hey, you can't do this. You have to like replenish the nutrients, right? The nitrogen and the phosphorus. Now, if you've ever lived in a place that has a yard and you had a dog, you might notice that wherever the dog goes to the bathroom, whether it's urine or feces, the grass tends to grow really well there. And the reason is urine and feces have nitrogen and phosphorus in them. And so farmers notice this. And so what they traditionally they said, look, I have these animals. I have pigs. I have goats. I have horses. I have cows. I'm just going to save up all their feces and just make a big pile of animal poop, call it manure. And then once a year, I'm just going to take a year's worth of my animals' waste and I'm going to spread out over the field. And essentially, you're just returning those nutrients that the cow it ate grass or it ate plants, right? And what it did is it extracted the energy from it. But what came out the other end in this feces was all the nutrients that the animal wasn't eating it for the nutrients. The animal was eating it for the food, so the nutrients didn't come out in feces. So spread out. We do this to this day. I mean, there are municipalities. I don't know if here in Korea, I don't know, but in many places they'll take human feces from a sewage treatment plant, and they'll make sure it doesn't have any unhealthy bacteria in it, and they'll spread that over crop because guess what? Our feces also have a lot of these same nutrients in it. Now, another traditional method that farmers have used is called crop rotation. So, crop rotation involves instead of just planting the same crop year after year after year, like corn. Right? You can make a lot of money planting corn or potatoes, right? Well, you remember you're going to end up depleting your soil of nitrogen, among other things. Well, it turns out that there's one category of plant called legumes. There's like peas, beans, um, lentils, things like that. They have these nodules, these little bumps on their roots. They're called root nodules that are filled with a bacterium, and it's a nitrogen-fixing bacteria, like the same kind of found in just loosened soil. But it's basically these plants have a symbiotic relationship where they basically take some of their sugars and feed it to these bacteria. So these bacteria grow really really well, and they make a lot of nitrogen for the plant, right? So it's a great deal for the plants. Well, what you do is, you know every other year, you plant corn one year, and the next year you plant peas, right? Then you chop off the peas and you leave these root nodules in the ground. Well, they just added a lot of nitrogen that was in the air. So instead of using animal waste, you're extracting from the air using nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And this is still used in modern farming too, just not as much as it should be, because beginning in the early 1900s, chemical companies realized, hey, guess what? We can make nitrogen compounds that are water soluble that you can sprinkle or spray on your fields, and you get this amazing. I mean, put as much as you want, right? More than manure can give you, more than crop rotation can give you. So you can really, really boost the productivity of your farms and grow a lot more food and make a lot more profit, or and similarly feed a lot more of the world's growing population. But the problem is with these high nutrient chemicals is that it's really easy to put too much in a field, and then it ends up leaving the field during rain events, and it gets into streams and lakes. And when it does that, it causes an incredible deterioration in a process known as eutrophication. So eutrophication occurs basically. The long and short of it is this: eutrophication occurs when nutrients get large levels of nutrients get injected into a system, okay, into a water system, and that allows algae to grow like crazy. And then, as the algae, which are single-celled plants, when they die, bacteria then eat them. Well, when bacteria eat them, they have to breathe, just like you and I do, in order to respire, in order to access that energy. And that means, just like when you breathe, you take oxygen out of the air. When these bacteria breathe, they take oxygen out of the water. So we notice this tremendous diminishment in oxygen as a consequence of adding nitrogen and phosphorus into these bodies of water. So that's basically what eutrophication is. So it's when we put nitrogen and phosphate into a stream. Here, I'll just walk you through it here. Okay, so here's a runoff from a farm. It's got nitrates. It's got phosphate. Okay, so I have nitrogen and phosphorus. It gets into the water, and there's algae floating in the water. And that algae is like, hey, you know what? These atoms are in short supply, right? They're my limiting factor. That's what limit the growth of the algae. Well, it's not limited anymore because I just put a bunch of it in there. And so just like it makes plants on a crop field grow well, it makes aquatic plants grow well. So the algae just explodes. We call it an algae bloom. Like all of a sudden the water literally will turn green. Okay. Yeah. And so well, what's the problem with that, right? You think, well, that's not a big deal, right? So there's plenty to go around. Plenty of nitrogen is good for everyone. Well, it's really not that great for the stream. And here's why. Or lake, because what happens is it gets so thick that the ones below end up dying. Okay, all animals die eventually anyway, right? Or I'm sorry, all plants, all living things. Okay, and as these things fall to the bottom, then the dead algae start to pile up at the bottom of the lake or the stream. Well, what we notice is that the dissolved oxygen, the oxygen that the fish would want to breathe, for instance, it starts being taken out of the water by the bacteria that are now eating these dead algal cells. And so there's suddenly this tremendous decrease in the amount of available dissolved oxygen in the body of water, and it can be quite catastrophic. So much that it leads to this huge fish kills, like all the fish in the lake die. Okay, or if not all of them, many of them. Right? So it leads to a very unhealthy stream that has a real impact on its biodiversity. So let's just talk about how you can tell a healthy stream from an unhealthy stream. I'd like you to be able to just look and tell. I mean, I can tell. It doesn't take that much. When you look at a healthy stream, what you're going to notice is this. The rocks are just rocks. They don't have a lot of tenderly algae growing on them. The water's not a green color. It's very clear. The rocks aren't slippery, really, because they're not covered with the slimy algae. And what that does then is there's lots of available oxygen in the water. There's still some plants, right? You still have an ecosystem there. You still have a food web, but what you find is there's a lot of insect larvae that can live. They need a lot of oxygen, a lot of dissolved oxygen, and they live underwater for a period of their life. It's like those dragonflies you see flying around. They start their life as insects living under rocks in these streams, and then there's trout fish. They're very, very fast moving predatory fish that eat those organisms. So that's basically what the food web of a stream is supposed to look like. But when it eutrophies, that's not what it looks like. It looks like this. Okay, so all of a sudden I have a lot of algae, and I don't have much oxygen. And because there's not much oxygen, I don't have those insects that need the oxygen living there, like the dragonfly larvae. They're not there, and that means the trout can't be there because A, they don't have enough oxygen to breathe because they need a lot of it. They died from lack of oxygen, and B, they don't have anything to eat, right? So we tend to find is what lives there is not completely devoid of life. What we find there is like weird worms, like these round worms called tubifex worms or carp. So if you look at the streams here in Korea, you see this big fish all over the place. Those are carp. Guess what carp eat? They eat algae. Guess what? They don't have very high oxygen demands, so they can live in low oxygen water. So when you see a lot of carp, that generally tells you that this is not a very healthy body of water. When you see trout, like if you go to a national park here in Korea and you look at the streams there, you see a very different population of fish. That's because they don't have eutrophied streams when you get out of areas that are not affected by agriculture. Now, worse yet is that it's one thing for a lake or a stream to have a problem, but what happens? Where do streams all lead? They lead to the ocean, and so what happens is when you get into the ocean, all these nutrients get out there, and that's usually the limiting factor of growth in the ocean is nutrients, right? So all of a sudden, at the mouth of this river, we're depositing all of this nitrogen and phosphorus that came off of all these farms in the whole watershed. And so we get this tremendous algae blooms offshore of these rivers. And then, the plankton die. In this case, the planktonic algae die. Same thing. The bacteria start to eat them, and you get this region where there's just almost no oxygen at all. So there's to the point that we call it a dead zone. Like when they go in there with a submersible, to look for life, there's just like no life there at all. And these things are huge. And these things cover vast areas of the ocean at times. So there's just all the fish had to leave because they couldn't breathe. There just wasn't enough oxygen to live there. And so like some certain places like the Mississippi River is a classic like permanent dead zone because you have basically all the farms in the United States pretty much all drain out in the mouth of the Mississippi River. So there's all these nutrients. Look at that. What you're seeing is from space. You are seeing algae blooms. Right? That is not how the ocean's supposed to look. That algae is there because there's a lot of nutrients. Well, if they measure the amount of dissolved oxygen, what they find is there's really not much in there. So there's very, very little dissolved oxygen there. So there's very little life there. So we call it a dead zone. All right. And so you can see like here's the nutrients coming from cities and farms. You can see that it's farms that are really the biggies that do it. But from all nitrogen from farms here is going to make its way out to here. So we get this big dead zone because basically a huge portion of the United States has its fertilizers draining into one place. Now, eutrophication, in addition to causing dead zones, it can also kill coral reefs. See the fish there? It's easy to miss, okay? What happens is when algae starts to grow on coral, well, then the coral can't access light and it can't filter feed. They're supposed to be filter feeders. And so the coral polyps die. And when coral polyps die, they don't come back. I mean, like that when you think of coral, you're thinking of really the skeleton that the animals are supposed to live on. But when the animals on that skeleton die, nothing comes back. They don't come back and re-inhabit that particular skeleton. They have to grow it all over again. It takes a long time, so it's pretty catastrophic. And of course, if you kill the coral, then you kill the whole, tropical reef ecosystem is thrown out of balance. So, bottom line is, fertilizers are great for helping us feed people, but we really have to be mindful of how to prevent this from happening. All right, and there's ways of doing it. And basically, traditional farming methods work, but we have to find a way of doing it at a larger scale. All right, thanks for watching.